This is timing belt replacement on a 748, 916, 996, 851, 888, just early Desmoquattro without the adjustable pulleys, so just the normal fixed cam pulleys. All the timing marks on these engines are exactly the same. Timing mark there on the timing shaft lines up with the slot on the primary drive cover. Vertical inlet cam lines up with the mark there on the cover. Vertical exhaust cam, again, there's a mark there that says V. You'll see there's the lines here that say O, which is horizontal, and that's the marks they use on the horizontal cylinder. There and there, one down the bottom, and one on the exhaust cam. So that's all the marks on these engines, just to make sure they're right before you pull them apart. When you undo the adjusters here, this adjuster is on an 8mm stud, and the stud screws into the cylinder head, and the other side is also 8mm. And sometimes people Loctite these, just don't Loctite them, but some people love doing that sort of shit. So you need to be really careful when you undo this nut that you hold the tensioner, so that way the stud doesn't turn. Because if the stud turns, the stud may then be loose in the head, and it might cause you issues later. So, undo that, back it off, and there we go. To make it easier, I often just remove them. That should just slide off. And you can see, I'll slide the belt out of the way. You can see the stud here, it's a 19mm hex. If you're paranoid, make sure it's tight. It should be Loctited into the head, but it's always worth checking. And while you're doing this, when the belt's off, check the rollers. And that one you can't really hear any noise. Often you'll hear a sort of a dry noise, and even though they feel okay, if they're making that dry noise, I usually replace them. It's a pretty generic bearing, so it's not a big deal, but it's well worth doing. On the vertical cylinder, you haven't got the access you have on the horizontal, which is why you need the offset 12mm spanner. It's been quite tight. And again, always make sure you hold that 22mm hex on the tensioner to ensure it doesn't go anywhere. Now when you pull these apart, I'll spin this one, it's fine. In the manuals, it usually says to replace these nuts. That's not something I was told when I first started on these things, and I've realistically never replaced them unless the hex is damaged. If the hex is damaged and you can't get a good tighten on it, then replace them, but apart from that, I've never really seen the need. When you take the belts off, the only camshaft with load on it is this cam here. So when you pop the belts off, that cam will spin, like that. But all the others are sitting on their base circle. So get the old belts out of the way. These are the old Gates belts, the generic Gates belts, not the Ducati Gates belts. These are the ones that cause all the problems. And spin the roller, feels fine. I usually just spin the cams to make sure there's nothing unusual happening with them, just because I'm here. And then we put the new belts on. Start with the vertical. When you're putting the belts on, you always come from this side, from the fixed tensioner side, because when you tighten the belts up, if you put them on from this side first, it will roll everything clockwise as you put tension on the belt, and that leads to people having the timing off. I don't really understand if people don't actually see it while they're doing it, but it's one of those things that seems to confuse people. Okay, now this cam has load on it, so you just turn it around and it should sit on the nose of the inlet at about the right spot, about there. Put the belt on, hook the belt around, Then we put the tensioner back on. Sometimes you need something just to spin the belt out past it. Start again. It's got a, it isn't sitting on the bottom pulley properly, and it's got like a one tooth gap at the bottom. Did that get rid of it? No. Slide it off. Down on the bottom, underneath the bottom pulley, the belt's not sitting in properly. You just got to make sure the belts are sitting in properly. Occasionally they'll do something like that. Okay, that one's right. Spin it around till it's about right. Belt on. Should be able to get the tensioner on fairly easily. There we go. What I usually do now is put a little bit of tension on them. With the tensioners, you always rotate them counterclockwise or anti-clockwise. If you rotate them clockwise, go that way, it pushes the eccentric into the middle and the belts get very close together here. I've seen them on bikes where the belts are almost touching, and you don't want that. So always go anti-clockwise, and you'll sort of see when you get the slack out of the belt, and that's sort of about enough for the moment. Similar thing on the horizontal. It's a bit easier to get to though. Again, just make sure everything lines up with the marks. If you need to put dots on the belts or do anything else that makes it more obvious to you, do so, but in my mind the dots on the cams and the covers are the most self-explanatory marks you're going to find. Just a little bit of tension on that. Okay. You can also, if you want to do the vertical cylinder without load, you can rotate the timing shaft until the second hole around, that one there, which is threaded, lines up with the mark here. And that's 135 degrees on the timing shaft to 270 degrees on the crank. And that's vertical top dead center firing. And on the camshafts, you use these holes here to line up with these marks. And that way there's no load on the cams. But I have shown people how to do that in the past and then seen them line this hole up with the mark lined up here, the dot lined up, and then bend valves. So it's one of those things that's kind of obvious to me, but unless you really understand it, I wouldn't try it. So now we'll turn the engine over a heap of times. I'm using the back wheel for this. You can use a turning tool if you like. First though, I'll turn it over really slowly, just to make sure nothing hits anything. If it's going to hit, it'll hit with the dot on the timing shaft about there, on the horizontal, or it'll hit about there on the vertical. But, made it all the way around. So I'm in top gear, I'll go down to first gear. Again, brace your midsection when you're doing this, it can be hard on back. Okay, so now the belts are sitting where they want to sit. They sort of assume their positions, and now we can adjust them. So now on to adjusting the belts. You do each cylinder at top dead center firing, in which case for the horizontal, that's when the mark is lined up with the slot. And you can see the two marks here lined up with the O marks on the covers. What I usually do is use the old lowener tool. This was the original 4-valve tension tool. Just pop that on. It's going to annoy me. If I can get to that somewhere. So we just back this off, pull it up so it goes past 2.5, and then let it come back again to 2.5. Oops, tighten that up and smooth. The problem with this tool is that you can't take it off and put it back on and check tension. It's a single shot, so if it's moved a little bit or something, you sort of need to start again, which is always a bit annoying with it, but it's just the way it worked. There for the moment. For the vertical, we turn the engine over to vertical top dead center firing, in which case the dot comes here, and this second hole lines up with the slot there. Which is just there. The tool on. Again, you always only go anti-clockwise when you're adjusting the belts, so that way the pulley eccentrics don't push the belts together. Oops. Or the belt runs together. This is a bit hard to do working around the camera. Oops, lost it again. I'll just show you with the lowener tool. If you take it off and put it back on again, it was 2.5 before, and now it's reading 4 or so. So it's not a tool to check tension with, it's a tool to set tension with. And we can also check it with an app on the phone if we want. We'll use the N-Track tuner. Spin the engine over to top dead center horizontal firing. We've got about, about 110 hertz, which is good. That's what we want. So that's sort of the correspondence between the lowener tool and the sonic method. Spin it around to vertical top dead center firing, dots pointing forward. We check these ones down here. Again, about 110, 105. So that's just the correspondence between the two tools. And now we just need to torque up tensioner nuts to 25 Newton meters. The horizontal one is easy. The vertical one not quite so, because you can't get access to it. You can do it by hand, or you can put a tool in here and use the transfer moment. There we go. I've been thinking I could make a little U-shape tool to get in there, but never got to it. And that's belt replacement on a old Desmoquattro. The later Desmoquattros, ST4Ss, S4Rs have adjustable cam pulleys, and the locations are quite a bit different for them dots on the cylinder heads, but I've got another video showing that. Once we've tensioned the belts, sometimes people will say there's a deflection between the cams you can use to indicate whether the tension's right or not, or a certain amount of twist or whatever. I sort of avoid those methods because it's so subjective. But we want to lift the belt up. That's sort of moderate push, I guess. And that's, people will say, you know, if it's 3 millimeters from the edge of the cover here, that's about right. It just depends on how hard you want to push things. Spin the engine over to horizontal, top dead center. We can get down here to the long run of the belt. You can turn that, you know, at least 45 degrees very easily. So it just depends how you want to push them or how you want to feel it. But I don't find any of these methods really that scientific personally.